So, welcome to Dan Astin Gergory, who, interestingly, I was in a field with last week at a campfire conversation, which Dan may describe to you, where quite a relatively small group of people were definitely giving rise to something interesting and new for politics. And I mentioned that the fact that we were in this field was because it was happening in a really, in a sense, grassroots community space. And yet, Dan is very much an integrally informed person who has been running a podcast called Elevate, or We Are Elevate, for a while now. I'm going to ask Dan to tell us a little bit about how he started and why he started that. But in case he misses the stats, they've had 10 million views. They have 50,000 subscribers, and there's 5,000 of the Elevate Network membership that we should keep in mind as Dan is speaking. So, Dan, welcome to being on the other side of the conversation for a change.
Thank you.
And why not start with just telling us why you started this? What was the context, and a little bit about your background and why you would be this person doing this?
Well, it's where to start. I'll keep the initial belt brief just because there's a long story behind it. But I'll open by saying, even as a child, I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I remember watching the 6 o'clock news with my father, and there was this animated conversation, we'll say, on the screen, these grey-haired gentlemen in suits leaning across these green leather-bound benches, and lots of jeering and shouting. And at that stage of my life, I had no idea what I was witnessing. So I asked my dad, and he said, "This is your government. This is this is politics." And there was something about it, even as a 7 or 8 year old, that didn't make sense to me. Just at the point, I mean, things have changed a little bit now, but there was just a very distinct character type, and the jeering and the shouting left me quite bemused. And here I am now, 30 years on, 38 years old. And yes, some of the faces have changed. It's become a little bit more diverse, but the premise in the way that the country is governed in the United Kingdom has really not changed. So that's a little pretext in terms of my open mind around politics since a very young age. I remember taking part in, mock elections as a child, and always had an interest in the world around me. Now, with regards to Elevate, we launched this year. I've created a lot of content in the last 6, 7 years on a variety of topics, but Elevate was really born out of a sense of, or a deeper awareness of a lot of the structural and systemic challenges that not only British society is facing, but actually an increasingly acute awareness of global challenges, and also the intrinsic linkages between national governance and international governance, both in terms of formalized structures, but also in informalized structures in terms of the role of unelected organizations and individuals, and the influence that various different organizations may have upon the political process, including corporations. And I suppose it was a tipping point where I've recently become a new father, and I kind of don't want to get to the point where my son is 8 years old. We probably won't be watching television. I tried to eliminate mediate my media diet. But I have feared the idea that my 8-year-old son, when he gets to that age, would have the same story as me. We'd look at the screen together and he'd say, "Daddy, what's this?" And I'll say, "Yes, this is a story that hasn't really changed." So becoming a father was a kind of tipping point into action when it comes to, okay, I no longer want to be a passive observer of what I'm witnessing and carrying the various degrees of frustration that kind of peak up and down depending on current events, and become an active participant in change. And the kind of premise behind Elevate is to recognize that, or to acknowledge the belief that citizens, people of the world, have an incredible, ingenuitive capacity to imagine solutions to problems. History has shown us that. So what we're trying to galvanize is people power, really, to address some of the most pressing issues that the world is facing, both on a local, regional, national, and international basis, and to really start to examine what I call the root cause issues of some of the challenges that we're facing today, in order that we start to go beyond patchwork solutions, because I think we tend to respond to political issues with very short-term, whether you're going down the campaign route, political activism, etc., which tends to address micro policy issues. Not micro, not micro in the sense of the gravity of them, but it rarely gets below the surface in terms of actually addressing the systemic issues that underpin them. So Elevate was born out of a desire to think differently to provide transparency, to try and examine these critical issues through content, to help drive wider awareness of the issues, because I believe that awareness is the first step to change, and that, in order to activate people in a political process, particularly if the political process is not particularly sexy in the form that I've described in the opening gambit of this conversation, then how do we activate people in like myself who actually want to participate in change? So it's very much in its infancy. We've been content led, but we want to really expand by creating more and more content on the critical issues, the core issues facing our world, and invite people to explore solutions and create localized, regionalized working groups, really, to explore practical, deliverable solutions, initially outside of the political system. This is why I kind of call it non-political political solutions, whereby actually quite a bit of change can be created outside of the current structures, and that does in many ways, in my view, will place some pressure upon the existing structures. But in parallel to some of the practical things, and we're recording this today, on the 4th of August 2022, and the headlines are around the cost of living crisis, the economy, inflation, and there are very practical things that we can do on a localized basis, non-political political solutions, to actually ease some of those problems. But there is also political solutions. But if we only ever focus on the issues of the day, then we'll never get to the big questions around what does political transformation look like, what does economic transformation look like. So the long-term vision for Elevate is really to create an environment whereby a very diverse group of individuals can come together in an environment which enables us to examine what alternatives could look like, which is what I'm most excited about, because my background for the last 10 years has really been around entrepreneurship, and previously working with startup founders to transform their ideas into reality. And as a result, I've learned some wonderful processes that can help people to truly understand the kind of core issues that they're trying to solve, the stakeholders that are involved in those core issues, and how to become creative in developing new solutions, whether that's something that's incremental that can make a leap in performance, or something that's truly innovative that can actually create significant change. And I think some of that thinking, along with integral thinking and other practices, can hopefully, with our partners, to create some of the conditions for these types of conversations to occur that will go beyond conversation to, whilst conversation is necessary to gain an understanding of the issues and a common understanding of the problems, and that in itself, we can talk about, is a challenge actually to gain agreement on what the core issues are. But there are processes to support that, to actually then creating minimum viable solutions, as you would do in the entrepreneurial world. And we were discussing this week the concept of a minimum viable government. What would, if you were to build a government project and designing, using design thinking practices and systems thinking, for instance, to design a new government model, what would be your MVP or your minimum viable state, to actually test, to actually pilot it? Because, the entrepreneurial kind of lean startup approach effectively enables you to test as you build, and you build, measure, learn. And I think some of those approaches, is I've gone into a little bit of detail here, so feel free to stop me. Is
Yeah,
somewhat
I'm gonna
yes,
stop you,
yes,
because there's a lot of questions I want to get before we get to that point,
yes, yes,
right?
of course.
So let's keep the MVP.
We'll come to that. Yeah.
We'll enshrine it over here as the thing
Yes.
we need to get to. And I'm going to ask you just a few questions about what is in your thinking now, because it's only a year, but as you described, you brought quite a lot to it before you started.
Yes.
So let's look at that for a second. And then what have you learned since you've been in this year? So you mentioned that you brought your entrepreneurial skills and then thinking, and amongst that you included integral thinking. For the sake of this audience in particular, how would you describe that? How would you describe the thinking that is integral thinking to a potential audience of, well, on the one hand, they are integral thinkers, but on the other hand, people interested in a new politics?
Yes, I think the way I would simplify it, and I'd like to keep it as simple as possible, is to recognize the importance of the whole system and the whole terrain, and to gain an understanding of, firstly, an empathetic understanding of different perspectives, points of views, modes of operation, different systems and structures, and firstly to gain an appreciation, even if one is in discord with one's own personal viewpoints that may have emerged over time, but more importantly to start to understand what are the key value levers within each of those approaches. What's actually really most important, what's really effective, what do people value the most within those modes of thought. So if you're looking at, say, a political spectrum, and you were to categorize the kind of different political realms of thought across the political spectrum, really trying to get a deep understanding of the core premise of those viewpoints, even if they differ from your own, in order to start to think about how you can incorporate the best of the wide spectrum, and also understand what some of the pitfalls are. So that's an incredibly simplistic understanding that I've brought to this, but to me, my initial exploration into integral came from a personal frustration that whenever I embraced the idea of social change in the last decade, I came across groups who may have mastered the art of the diversity of people, but yet had failed to master the art of the diversity of thought. And I found that very frustrating, and I found it was actually interestingly exclusionary, because you had to align with the way of thinking of the group. Otherwise, very quickly you find your questions and challenges are unwelcome. And that for me became, even in environments where I actually agreed with the dominant way of thinking, I still looked at all of the people outside the room and thought, well, if we are going to systems change, we're not building a private island here.
Yeah. We're not going to all agree.
So it was born out of a frustration of recognizing not only the need to understand a wider set of perspectives, but actually incorporate them into thinking.
So incorporating them, what in your mind is the incorporating entity? Are you simply talking about a country or a community, or is there some other vehicle you feel is incorporating multiple perspectives?
I think there are processes that can be developed. It's very difficult because I've also come to recognize as someone who's facilitated many workshops over the last decade, the role of the facilitator brings the potential for its own biases, and there are certain things in the process that you need to be aware of and put to mitigate against some of those things. But I do think with a set of principles and a well-facilitated discussion, you can draw out, supported by research, you can draw out various different perspectives. And we had a micro session on this just in this week on the concept of on this idea of prototyping, looking at governments in particular, we asked the question, what is the optimal role of a government or state? And led to some very spirited discussion, of course, because people have different viewpoints, but we created the conversation in a way that actually enabled everyone to hear each other's perspectives without interruption. It gave people the opportunity to delve deeper into their perspective. It gave people the opportunity to challenge and ask questions. But the way in which it was created left people actually smiling rather than yelling or in conflict. And it was a really strong way, I think, to at least begin the process of gaining understanding and empathy. Its objective is not to nudge someone towards a particular viewpoint. It is to lay the viewpoints on the table. And having done practices like this over the years, and a recent example, we worked with 40 different organizations, and it took many hours for us to come, just to agree upon what the core issues we were going to focus on. It took around 2 hours to get down to 5 core issues, with much spirited conversation around those things. But it gained an appreciation of the whole, but it enabled us to find a common ground from which then to build upon and to grow. So I think integral thinking can actually help to deliver that. It can help to find a starting point for which collaboration can begin.
Right. So I'm going to just reflect back to what I heard there, because it sounds to me, if you're starting with a diversity of all kinds, not just people, but thinking, and you are holding a conversation, but you're coming to an agreement. So is that the goal, to come to an agreement where those 5 things can be moved on as a point of collaboration? And if so, just to come back to my earlier question, what is the container for that thing once it's been achieved? What useful container can that be once that's been achieved?
Yeah, I mean, this is the crux of the challenge, because if the container has been established with a specific problem in mind, which has, and again, this is actually where the perfectionist in me wants to manage for the various different challenges that come with this. Because let's say you determine a challenge, you state the problem, and then you put an open call out for participation. By virtue of doing that, you're going to attract people who already share some degree of understanding of the problem. However, those individuals may not be totally representative of those who are affected by the problem. So the example I've given in terms of our recent project, we weren't as thorough. It was part of an illustration rather than an actual. It wasn't a live project. It was to illustrate the process of coming to an understanding. And the second part of your question was, is the goal to come to an agreement? And again, that really depends on the container of the project. Sometimes there is simple merit in creating the conditions for people to develop empathy and to experience the practice of reaching empathy and understanding for different points of view without experiencing conflict. And that becomes a different objective. Because it doesn't necessarily therefore then need to lead to a potential collaboration. But by virtue of being part of such a process, the chances are that you can then take those skills, if well honed, to other conversations where perhaps there is a practical outcome that is being sought, and it becomes a skill set actually, and it's almost a renaissance of the art of empathy, because in an increasingly polarized and divided world, finding common ground and solutions is increasingly challenging. And what that leads to, and another frustration, is that again it leads to silos, and silos developing solutions for siloed groups, even if there is a much wider audience affected by the problem. And then to get buy-in to the solution, therefore, if you haven't actually incorporated a wider, more representative group of stakeholders, then you can only go so far. And I think my examination of political alternatives in the past has partly can be attributed to that problem, whereby it's a singular issue that people have come together on in the first instance, which rallies a certain degree of support. But when it comes to the wider population to embrace it, it's not been built with their viewpoints incorporated, at least considered. So it's a very interesting question. The container, how the container is defined is critically important, and the outcome that is set. But then the invitation process in terms of who you invite to be part of such an experience has to be very carefully considered, because again, it's very easy to bring like-minded people together, whereas I would much rather consider open-minded people rather than like-minded, in the sense that but even then, you're actually then excluding viewpoints that are perhaps more challenging. But this fundamental discussion illustrates even the difficulty of actually truly applying integral processes, because the human factor. One of my mentors says that she's got 19. Her quote is, "I've got 99 problems, and every one of them is a human being." It's the human problem, but it's one that we can't avoid, and it's one that's absolutely necessary. But there is no utopian perfection to the model that I've come across, but we just have to mitigate against those difficulties in actually embracing a really truly integral process.
I mean, the other reason for the question of what is the container is because so often people are experiencing life in the internet.
Yes.
That is in a way their terrain.
Yes.
And they imagine that their Twitter stream or their Facebook group or whatever is the container. And then maybe they'll have, generate solutions in that space. How do you get out of that when the reality is it's a bubble in almost all cases? And are there other kinds of containers? Obviously, I'm pointing at the fact that you're working at community level. In what way is that a better container, or in what way is that a different container from the internet at large? Numbers aside, obviously, we're obviously talking about different numbers. But how do you imagine when you're thinking, when I met you in a field in Somerset, how are you thinking that change could happen through, for example, the container of a community? Does that give you more traction, or do you feel it gives you less in terms of the solutions that are generated?
It's a very interesting question. So as firstly, I want to comment on the kind of digital realm, the social media. I think in order for such a process to occur, there has to be some recognition. And the same is true irrespective of digital technology, but from what I'm about to say, but our viewpoints are largely reinforced by social media, because the algorithms will typically serve up similar content which reinforces our current worldview. So it's Twitter isn't taking an integral approach to my daily feed.
No.
It would be. I actually think that would be a fantastic project, but that's something for another day.
Yeah.
So it reinforces our current biases, and when we do come across content that is different to our own, it's usually in a way that is so polarizing that it results in inflammatory conversations. So as a container for inviting debate, I don't think some of the social channels are a useful tool. It's not to say that the tool, they don't have uses, but it's certainly a starting point when it comes to collaboration. I don't think it's the right arena. Neither do I think, even though something like Zoom, like this, I think the virtual conversations are a fantastic tool. It enables us to connect across borders, across time zones. But in terms of a collaborative process, the subtleties of communication are lost in a screen. We don't even see the parts of the human body that we would see across a table. We don't pick up on the subtle cues that occur within communication in a physical environment. But it's a reasonable substitute in the absence of an alternative. But to answer your question around the community event, face to face, I mean, it was a unique environment, in a field, in a barn. And actually, there is something to be said for taking us out of our usual contexts as a starting point, because even in familiar contexts, it comes with reinforcement of our current behaviors. So if you're in office environments and conference rooms, there is some pre-established norms that are kind of triggered by being in our usual experience and our usual domain. So by virtue of actually changing the domain, changing the context, it actually in its first instance creates the conditions for a more open conversation. But the very nature of face-to-face, I believe, creates the opportunity to have a more open and empathetic conversation. But it does require work. Our event that we put on, you were part of for a short period, but it was really a 4-day process where the kind of conditions were set through the principles on the Friday evening, which kind of laid the groundwork for openness, going from open-minded to open-hearted to simply open experiences over the course of the 4 days, and combining discussions, debates with other forms of activity, including movement and other well-being practices, actually enabled us to not only think intellectually through the mind, but we also were able to involve our body in different ways, and to have shared experiences that actually break down many of the barriers that prevent us from having deeper, more meaningful connection. So it could be seen as an unorthodox approach, particularly if people are used to turning up in nice conference rooms in their suits and ties. But I think even during my corporate years, the times we had offsites and we took the context out and we changed the way that we, barriers and pretenses start to drop, and it creates more harmonious conditions, or potentially for more structured conversation. And we have very default behaviors as human beings, so it takes an adaptation of context, I think, to actually circumnavigate that wiring. But also the container you mentioned, I think, is the way we set up the conversations is of vital importance, because it sets the conditions for the discussion. Everything from ensuring that everyone has the space to share openly, that people can express freely without interruption, and that people can be openly challenged and questioned, and it's not a personal. Depersonalizing the conversation, and actually creating a space where different conversations can occur. And, it was quite. To me, it felt like a social experiment. But one that actually was deeply empowering and enriching. And the big question that's left is that a scalable? Is that a scalable proposition in terms of involving wider stakeholders? And there's all kinds of theories around. You take Dunbar numbers, for instance, which we were pretty close to the Dunbar number for the experience, which there's research in terms of how groups are structured and the impact that makes. So all of these things can be considered, but in order to really create systemic change, perhaps we do need to think about bigger groups. But it was an interesting starting point, I think.
So let's just say a bit more about that. So you're saying that there could be a theory of change arising out of this kind of patterning of experience. So the thing that you designed, if it was happening everywhere, could have what I would describe as a fractal effect rather than a scaling effect, which is a bit more top down,
Yes.
Or it's also more uniform generally, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
So this would not be that. Tell me a bit more about if you like, the science of it, and so people might be able to understand.
Well, I've used the term Dunbar's number, and again, I'll radically simplify it, but it's based around the idea of the number of 150. It's from a kind of sociological, anthropological study which looks at the number of people whom one individual can maintain a reasonable degree of relationship with, where each person knows who the other is and how they can relate to the other within that group. And whilst the numbers varied across the course of the 4 or 5 days, they were generally in that ballpark figure.
Mm.
And in the debrief, there was a sense, even actually the opening night, people commented that they felt like they knew everyone already, even if they hadn't spoken to one another.
Mm.
So it creates that visceral familiarity, which is very subtle, but it's an interesting proposition. And the reason why I mentioned scale is because, again, it comes down to really, and maybe it's a limiting belief of my own, but even if you can, in a small group, begin to create a design process that starts to produce reasonable alternatives in any given endeavor or issue, particularly when we're talking about systemic issues, you would need to create a wider buy-in in order for it to be accepted, at least in a reasonably democratic fashion. So it's how do you take the outputs from an event, an experience like that, and introduce the outputs to others.
So I'm going to ask you a bit more just at that point. So each point I'm going to develop a little bit more as a question. So what you described there was 150 as being a number at which people could maintain relationship.
Yes.
I think that's quite a key word, because obviously you can have 100,000 people on your Facebook feed or whatever, or, a million people following you. That doesn't have relationship in it, right? That's simply connection. It is connection of a kind. It's a digital connection. But could you just say a little bit more about this distinction between that and relationship?
I think it's it's an interesting experience, actually, particularly having had quite a large reach of the podcast. It's a strange relationship because when you're broadcasting frequently, people will come and tell you they know so much about you. That they have actually unconsciously formed a relationship with me.
Yes.
But I don't have a clue who they are. Might see their names in the comments. And if they're using a real photo, hopefully they are a sense of who they are. But there's an absolute void, in my experience of the other person. Whereas in a physical environment like that, particularly over in a one-day experience, you would get a sense of familiarity with the group, visually. But over the course of 4 days, 5 days, there's a good chance that you will intersect with or interact with at least the majority of the group, which leads to the opportunities to build relationships within the room. But what's interesting, even if interpersonal relationships aren't built, because let's be real, even in those types of environments, the goal is not necessarily. I mean, some people will build new friendships or professional relationships in those environments, but that's not that's a side effect as opposed to the goal. Where it gets interesting is the shared consensus that they would like to continue working with the people that they'd interacted with over that period of time. So it creates a common bond, even and over the course of the 4 days that we're talking about, there were many disagreements, there were many differences in worldview. Yet despite that, there was an allegiance that was formed. Because it wasn't so much about the intellectual side of the discussion, it was more moving from mind to heart. And I know that might sound to some esoteric, but it's actually more about the human quality, the human connection that creates the environment for those types of impactful conversations to happen, and to share respectful disagreements when those conditions are set. And much of the feedback has actually been, as much as there was lots of discussion around some of the more material outputs, the more logical outputs, a lot of the feedback has been around the human qualities that were experienced in that type of environment. And I think, certainly from my observations within some of the issues that I'm tackling, it feels like some of the absence of those qualities that's part of the problem itself. So it brings us full circle to recognize the intrinsic relationship between personal change and social change. And these types of environments in which relationships can be built creates a sufficient degree of comfort and safety that people feel able to be open at different stages. Some people straight away they will go deep. Others it takes a little bit more time, but a little more connection, a little bit more psychological safety. But it creates the opportunity for more vulnerable and open conversation, a more authentic expression, which I think helps to break down some of the differences between us.
Yes, and also gives rise to innovation.
Yes.
Because of their never having had that possibility before, which I really like. I mean, I wanted to just give a good example of how I experienced it in that room, because for me there is a certain level of familiarity. It's like I always describe it as walking into a warm bath. You can sense when there's trust in the room, and you use the word heart. But I threw up this subject of something we might get to later called the parallel polis, this idea that there's autonomy in this. And then somebody from the audience said, yes, I totally get that. Yes. And then he described something that was completely, different. I mean, completely different from what I was describing, which I would have all sorts of words for. Right, what he was into, I would have called it this or that.
Yes.
And in the open public space, these are really he and I would have been on opposite sides of the debate. And yet I had no problem in that warm, bathy space to say, yes, that. Because I could see he was feeling something that I was feeling about autonomy and about the need to self-express and about freedom. That in that space, they could sit alongside each other, but anywhere else, it would have created a polarity. Yes. So I really experienced it and love it and think that that's right. And I'm wondering if 150 is sort of the size of a neighborhood rather than a town or a city. And, maybe that's a key a little bit to where these experiments can best happen. And in fact, I want to take you a little just back to when I'm reading about the podcast and how it started and COVID, in that COVID framework. Wasn't it actually neighborhoods that got connected in that space through WhatsApp and so on? And maybe they generated this kind of conversation for the first time. There was certainly a lot of evidence of that. Isn't that some evidence that what you're onto is what's happening as well, rather than something you wish would happen?
Yes, it is. But the reason I'm kind of smiling so broadly is for two reasons. One is, yes, it is, and that's part of the magic of it.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, it felt like it was a window in time where that warm bath feeling existed in the context of what's gone before us over the last couple of years. And it didn't take long for when the gears of the machine started moving again and life started to get back into action. And people had had introspection, they'd had opportunities to review their own values. I had so many comments. It's probably by the nature of the relationships I have, but people talking about their values and how they'd had this time to reflect. And people were talking about how they want to take better care of their health. And this was a broadening conversation. But then all of a sudden, as soon as the fast food chains open again, queues out the door. So, and those relations, and whilst I'm using it kind of to bring humour to the situation, the reality is some of those bonds and that warmth that was connected during that unique window have then fallen to the wayside. They haven't necessarily endured. So and that's not, that's somewhat of a generalization, but it's certainly my own personal experience of this in conversation with other members of our community. So it begs the question then, and it also begs the question from the back of Camp Out, for instance, because where I think there's an opportunity for a ripple effect is the embodiment of the experience that was captured in the room. So, and in the closing session of the week, we said, well, I said actually, that the moment you leave the site, the real world is going to be there. And all of those common disagreements and all of the things that frustrate you and all of the things and, life getting back to normal, it's very easy to feel that warm bath feeling in the context of what we've just experienced.
Yeah.
To use your words, which I think is quite lovely. But then you get back to the real world and all of a sudden it's, and I experienced it, father duties kicking back in, going back into Twitter, and experiencing everything I experienced. But there is a shift in those experiences, and it's about how we carry them with us into our day-to-day lives. But my experience of this in other contexts shows that it is almost necessary to have spaced repetition, to have similar experiences in order to maintain. And I think that's true in many areas. Even if you're talking about physical transformation, you can't go to the gym once or twice and expect to see a lasting result.
Yeah.
You know, so like anything, there has to be repetition in order to actually build the inner muscle, if you will, to use that analogy of that experience that you've had, so that then when you're in other environments, you can truly go to another meeting, whether it's in the corporate boardroom or wherever it is, in whatever context, and you can bring that more integral approach to the conversation, even if those around you are operating differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's how that kind of micro experience can actually start to very slowly create a ripple effect. And none of that is done then with an intention to proliferate any particular viewpoint or ideology. It's actually a way of experiencing community and collaboration.
Yeah. So if you've got these two tools now, so you've got the tool of the experience of the container, you know a little bit about how to facilitate that, but then there's the other tool that you've got, which is your podcast. Tell me a little bit about why you decided to do a podcast in particular, but also, well, these are the many questions, right? So to give you a bit of a chance. So, what have you learned from the podcast in this year? How has it grown your sense of what's possible? But also what it might be the relationship then between this podcast and this small fractal. Is there some partnership between these two things that is going to somehow help you reach the vision, or help us all, because there are many podcasts, I guess, and there are many community conversations happening. What is the relationship between these two things in your mind?
Well, I'll share what I think some of the relationship aspects are, but also share some of the challenges, because it's important to recognize the difficulties that come with this.
Yeah.
Firstly, I spoke about shortly a moment ago how it feels like there's a one-way relationship, in the sense that within the context of the podcast, because I broadcast so frequently, I don't just simply discuss the matter at hand in a kind of academic, intellectual fashion. I will share, my own personal feelings on things, my experience, my reflections, how my interpersonal life intersects with what I'm trying to achieve. So people get a sense of really knowing my character and a bit more about my life experience, but I don't reciprocally get to understand that without deliberately instigating a conversation with an audience member. So on what there's a relationship being built, and people find a connection because of the stories, and because the nature of my broadcasting goes beyond simply the subject matter, in through my solo content, a more deeper understanding of the way I'm processing the work that I'm doing. I think that deepens it presents the opportunity for a relatability that goes beyond the relevance of the conversation. So the relevance comes into the shared subject interest. There's a relatability that comes from a shared interest in a certain subject, but by being authentically myself in the different contexts that I operate, people can form a connection with me as an individual. And why this is important in the nature of what we've just discussed is what it does over time, particularly with frequency, again, talking about repetition. People get to go beyond your words and into your values. They start to understand who you are as a character, your attitudes, your behaviors, your core values. And what my feeling is, this is very subjective, I don't have objective data on this, but my observation would be that those who share not only a shared concern around the material aspect in terms of the subject matter, but also have a similar set of values, are most likely to be the ones that then turn up to the events, because they relate to the way, and not just what I'm doing, but the way in which it is done, the how. Now, where it gets tricky and where it's important is, particularly in terms of bringing an integral approach, because Elevate is different to my previous podcast. Elevate is taking a different approach. where I am trying to very much build the integral principles into the content. So bringing different people from different backgrounds. Now, there's only one of me, and on any given subject, there is a multitude of perspectives. So to be truly integral with just me, it's not going to happen. We can best endeavor to try and take the dominant polarities in a situation to at least give contrast. But there is a counter to that long term. You know, we want to build a content platform that's beyond myself, so that we can actually create a realm of content that is actually much more in alignment with a more integral approach, where there is a diversity of content. But in itself, that's even a problem, because once someone has developed a particular alignment with a certain viewpoint or ideology or belief or perspective, they typically look for content that reinforces their existing behavior, their existing worldview. And more of it is what they look for, because it continues to validate how they see the world. So it's actually trying to cultivate a mindset shift in people to say, actually, you will still get that because we are going to present multiple perspectives. So you'll still get that sense of validation, because that human need, I think, needs to be met. But you will also gain a wider range of a greater context, a greater understanding of any particular issue. And it's still going to have limitations, but it's because there's only so much content one can create and how much one can process. But that's the longer term play. The other core problem in its current state is there's a concept in the content world called audience capture, which means that if you take a certain perspective on a certain issue and people are aligned with that perspective or issue, they will come to you for that, and they'll take value in the coverage of that particular subject because they feel that relatability, that alignment. But then if there's a different issue that has where there may be a kind of a prescribed, in other contexts there may be a prescribed path. So if you think this way about this, then you're likely to think this way about that. Now we see this where there are kind of more tribal relationships where you're likely to see you'll have a similar worldview across a multitude of issues. Now, when you operate with integral thinking, the chances are that you may not operate in that linear fashion, so that you may see the world a certain way on one thing, and then the next thing where there may be a conscious or subconscious expectation that you'll also see the way that others see the things in this area too. And so then when you start creating content that goes against what their expectation of you is, then quickly that relationship can break down, because we've actually become so fractured as a society that this is happening at increasing micro levels. So you can find a real commonality with someone on a very distinct issue, but then they have a polar opposite view to you on something else, and all of a sudden you're their enemy. Even that you could have followed that person for years. They've been speaking about something that you have a shared interest in, and all of a sudden they have a different perspective on something else, and that the relationship breaks down. And we've seen that for the last couple of years. You know, I've had guests on my show who said that, you know, that there are entire communities that they've fallen out over particular issues around the pandemic. And that's one of the issues as a content creator, is that the pressure, that's why it's called audience capture, because you in order to, the incentive structure, because to continue to create content and that amasses a certain number of views, or there is almost a subconscious pressure to continue to create content that relates to the expectations of your audience, rather than following what is uniquely true to the broadcaster. And I know several other broadcasters that have actually in the recent months stopped broadcasting because they've felt that pressure so intensely that they're no longer being true to themselves, and they're no longer actually presenting the views that they want to present. So that's a unique challenge when it comes to content, but I think that can be overcome by what I've articulated in terms of the future plans of building a platform where it's no longer about one's individual perspectives. But even then, you know, our team and I were discussing it. You know, how do you regulate or curate your own content environment to ensure that you are embedding integral principles? Because who's the arbiter of that? And what the most interesting distinction I've taken here from actually examining mainstream media is that in order to determine, if you were to, for instance, wanted to determine the political leaning of a particular media outlet, you could judge it based upon the nature of their content and how it pertains to a previous, you know, a typically held understanding of political polarities, and that's how things are often judged. You'll say this is a left-wing or a right-wing broadcaster.
Mm.
The other way to look at it is to actually survey the audience and to actually establish the worldviews of the audience, to understand whether you have a diverse set of worldviews within your audience. Because if you have what in the content world is described as an echo chamber, whereby you've essentially got a group of people who only see the same way on certain things, then you know that you are inherently biased as a content outlet, and that your content is delivering on that bias. So
Sure.
there's some interesting thinking around the links between content and community experiences like this, because they should marry up. But the fact that there's a smaller number that come from that overall audience is reflective, I think, of that, the deeper piece around values, because that feeling that was created at the event is because even though there are some strongly held views amongst the groups, there's a willingness to hear others, and that's an environment now. And for me as a content creator, and for other content creators who are trying to actually solve or be part of the solution when it comes to polarization, is to recognize the role that we have to play in cultivating the desire to be truly curious and to seek understanding of other perspectives, and to do so without judgment, even if it internally grates us, because we're still human.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just to reflect a little bit back on what you're saying, because they are familiar political problems. People don't really talk about society in that way. So to me, it sounds as if you are politicizing the social here. So, which I think is a good thing, because you're helping us or this conversation reflects back the difficulty. And you're saying, which I find, acceptable, is that the right word? More than acceptable, is that you would suggest that maintaining curiosity and openness towards infinite amounts of diversity is the tenor, if you like. It's the way of being in your podcast or on your platform that might encourage more and more people. But you'll know as well that if there is such a thing as an opposition to that, or if you are looking at the reality now as it is being played out before us, others will be not trying to do that at all. They will simply be happy to seize the space of a clear viewpoint, a clear agenda, and clear biases.
Yes.
So where does your openness sit with that? Meaning, do you feel that, and if you accept that we do have a bit of a time frame, some people don't accept it, but let's assume that there is a time frame that the scientists tell us we have to get on with something to bring us together and raise solutions in the next 7 years. How do you imagine yourself evolving, or what's the logic of your evolving in this way, in this open, and when there are others in your space who might well be grabbing the ground from beneath your feet as you do that?
This is the difficulty. It is. Yeah. It is, and there's a distinct. Again, it's the way the digital environment is set up. It's reflective of our existing underlying systems. It's also reflective of the human condition, which is long established. Our tribal roots still play out today in the way that we consume content. So it would be much easier to take a strong position on any given issue and communicate effectively in a way that is relatable and appealing to others, and you would eat more easily. Right now, it would be much easier for me to generate an audience than it would be to take the approach that we're now trying to take. So to me, it is one of the greatest creative challenges. And I explained to my business mentor who I'm working with Elevate, is that personally, it feels like I need to, it's an evolution of the self, because in the first person, as me, I, of course, have my own strong views on things. I can't possibly take a truly integral view and effectively sit on the fence and just be in total harmony with. I say I can't possibly. Perhaps there is some evolution to that. There is perhaps, but there is some intrinsic things that, we will find a stronger alignment to, let's say. So on the one hand, there's the first person within me that has that, and that's always risks bias. because it's confirmation bias will want to bring stories that match with my current worldview. But there's almost like needing to tap into the third person of the self, which is, it's very hard to imagine, but one that is looking more objectively at a wider view, with the specific mindset of we need to present multiple sides of the story, which traditional media is supposed to do, according to the history of media. So digital media, has the opportunity to set a new standard there. But you're absolutely right. The way the system is set up, the way people's minds work, is that it's much harder. So actually, it's trying to find a different way to appeal to people that still meets the need. And again, this is entrepreneurial thinking in itself, because it's trying to find a way to meet their current wants and needs, whilst also introducing a deeper solution. And, my wife's a personal trainer, and, in her marketing materials, she'll speak to the problem that her clients are trying to solve. Usually it's around weight loss or various different physical goals. But once she's established a relationship, the process becomes about lifestyle transformation, it becomes about mindset, it becomes about dealing with your emotional traumas, making new choices. But if you advertise, come to join my lifestyle transformation course, which is going to deal with your emotional traumas, there's a very smaller number of people that's going to be appealing.
Yeah.
So the same challenge is true here in the content space, is it needs to somehow give people what they want and need, so that there is some content that validates their pre-existing biases, but offers the opportunity to learn more. But even this is difficult, because what happens is, and Twitter is the beautiful example / horrifying example of this, is that when it does present alternative viewpoints, it creates an instinctual reaction, not a response, not a considered, let me listen and carefully observe what's being said. There's an animosity that wants to wrong the other. So even in considering how we do this, we have to market the value of becoming open-minded. We have to help people understand the cost of polarization. And because we've discussed this extensively within our team, we believe that on a deep level, human beings are feeling a sense of suffering from the disconnection that is coming from an increasingly divided society. It's just, with many issues, people consider things outside themselves as being responsible for the way that they're experiencing the problem. The reality is how, despite the fact that we've got a social media environment that proliferates polarization, that does not stop any individual to actually take stock of how that plays out in their own personal relationships. So it makes it harder in the environment we're in, but it still means that if we can encourage people to feel that disconnect that they're experiencing in their own lives as a result of fractured relationships, the increasing polarization of the society, and the breakdown of community, and associate the fact that perhaps the way we behave online is less evolved than it is in the physical world, and therefore we need to, in many ways, mature and grow up. Can you be part of the change by coming and supporting platforms like ours, which is trying to find a way to both, yes, give you information that's going to tick the box of confirmation bias of what you're already looking for, but also offer a different perspective. And don't get me wrong, at the time of recording this, we're nowhere near where we need to be. It's just me, and for me trying to architect this is very hard. But over time, when I say it's just me presenting. We've got a team, but longer term, we want to have a platform where you have the opportunity to explore issues through multiple lenses. I would absolutely love it to go on Twitter, and on any given subject, it gives me 5 competing views on a single subject, all of which I can then, without a frenzied reaction, just be with those different perspectives. Now, of course, there's a whole other conversation around validity, credibility, misinformation.
I mean, I think you said enough, Dan, to suggest, it becomes very clear what it is that you would be upholding and how important it would be to develop the digital sphere to model, if you like,
Yes.
a different way of being, which then, of course, on the ground would be less difficult because all the reasons you said, but more difficult because there is real difference in our communities that we are very comfortable, alienating. It's like there are people we would rather walk past in the place we live. However, as a principle, what you're describing sounds like a genuine alternative to the current politics, which is built on division and knowing who the other is. It actually gives you license to hate around 50% of the people, the ones who vote the opposite way to you, and you're sort of very invested in the failure of that other 50%. This is already a different principle that you're describing that you could be upholding. Are you all right for another 10 minutes or so?
Yes.
Okay, so just to go, because there's two questions I want to ask. One is, in this year of, I'm making the assumption that this year of podcasting has led you to these conclusions. Can you just describe for our listeners, who you've been talking to, and maybe one or two of the key points that you thought, this is why I'm doing this podcast, for your own shifting, so to speak, because you mentioned it's your own shifting that is at the core, which I myself, as a political entrepreneur, would totally agree with you. It's how do I need to grow that would really give me a lot of indications, but then lead us into this idea of a political tour, because for me that becomes a third vehicle. In the three, you've described two very well now, but this is a third vehicle, and what would be the point of that is the question. So sorry, I've said two questions at once, but if you could take the first one first, it might lead us somewhat into.
Yeah, there's a few things. I've got a few things emerging. So, just to clarify in the vehicle sense, because this is a fresh conversation off the back of our meetings this morning internally. There are three vehicles that we are primarily intending on using. The first is content, which is really about helping to create context around current issues. The second is then events and experiences. So I would classify what we did in Camp Out as part of that second model around events and experiences, but I would also include the forthcoming tour within that category as an event and experience. And the third piece, which is we haven't started on yet, but it's also it's linked to work that I've done in the last 10 years outside of this context, is around actually creating enablement platforms or accelerator programs, if you will, which is using more of the entrepreneurial approach to help people who have got ideas that can affect some of the key issues, because we really want to create a process whereby the front end of the Elevate platform is the content, where we have a certain number of key issues that we're focused on creating content. The events and experiences will be connected to those, and they'll all intertwine personal and social transformation as part of in different doses. Sometimes there'll be a higher level of personal transformation as a focus, and there'll be other times where the social change is a higher focus. But either way, those are the two kind of key paradigms. And then, so the third stage is really about helping people who have ideas, or who have potential solutions, to actually go through a process to actually realize them into reality. So that's emergent, that's longer term, and working with my business mentor, she says that's three separate businesses, very ambitious. But we're applying entrepreneurial thinking to our own business, so we're doing everything kind of minimum viable product scale, so that we can actually test what we're doing. And the tour, which we can talk about later, will incorporate all three elements. We'll incorporate content, experiences, and some form of enablement for those people that we connect with on the tour. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So the other question I've lost.
I just was asking who you've been talking to over that year, and what were the shifts? I mean, were they specifically people from the integral world or not? And what were the shifts for you to, what did you either confirm in that year that you thought was already present, or how did you change in that year?
This is a juicy question. So really, there was inspirational guests that I've interviewed over the last few years that
Mm.
have created light bulb moments within me, that have either illuminated a wider challenge in the wider world, or they've illuminated something within myself that helped me to recognize a change that needed to occur. I can talk through some examples, but before I do that, I would suggest my content began in what I would describe as quite a propositional, in the propositional realm, meaning
Mm.
facts, figures, issue wise, looking at the kind of the different lenses of observing a particular issue.
Mm.
But as time moved on, it went from the propositional to looking at the cultural elements, the psychology of human behavior, the psychology of groups, guiding philosophies, history. So it started to create this kind of almost iceberg, the classic iceberg model where you start on the surface and you start to dig and you dig and you dig and you're trying to, and this is just the way my mind works. It's always asking the question, okay, if this is happening, how is it happening, and then why? Or sometimes I start with the why. In business, I tend to start with the why, the purpose. But as I'm discovering things, my brain in a childlike fashion is asking, well, why? Well, why? Well, why? And that's why it's taken me through the layers from the kind of mechanistic, propositional level, looking data, science, etc., through to looking at cultural factors, social factors, psychological factors, and philosophical factors, and looking at how those have evolved over time. Everything from conversations I've had in recent months around the transition from modernity to post-modernity, for instance, and where we're heading next, and what influence that has on the wider world view of organizations, whether it's academia, whether it's media, whether it's politics, the influence that our current worldview has on, and to what degree those elements play in the reality that we currently face. And some of those conversations that have enabled me to take a more systems-based or a more complexity-based approach, looking at the within the single frame or a single topic, getting to the point where I can actually understand the depths of a topic, but then looking at the interconnections. People say, "How do you sleep?" It's because I once I get something between my teeth, I want to understand it all, and I've had to limit my exploration here because a lot of my own revelations, I suppose, may have been provoked by a conversation with a guest, but it's the subsequent deep dive, multiple sources, multiple references, where I look for additional depth on any particular subject, and it's there that I've seen how complex the world is and how interconnected things are, from political systems to economic systems to social systems to cultural systems to guiding philosophies to basic human psychology, and the intrinsic links. But I also start to see patterns where perhaps we don't often, in business, in organizations, or as individuals, necessarily consider what I would describe as the second or third order consequences of our decisions. We get focused on a problem in front of us, and the solution that we come up with is designed to solve that problem, but rarely do we think about the knock-on effect, the consequences of that decision, and whether the consequences of those decisions could actually create greater consequences than the benefit that's created by the initial solution. Some of those are entirely unpredictable. So let's take social media as an example. Connecting the world, we're more connected than ever before, but we're also simultaneously more disconnected. And we've already talked about some of the polarization that occurs during the context of this conversation. That's a potentially unexpected or unanticipated second order consequence of building a platform in this way. But that doesn't mean that if there isn't an evolution or an iteration that can be created in the future that leads to a different way of thinking that could actually mitigate those second order consequences. And sometimes there's a learning curve we need to go through, but sometimes we need to look through things as a greater lens to actually try and have a more predictive approach to what those second order consequences may be. So those are some of the developmental elements that I've had. It's really brought me back to systems thinking, complexity, but there's a yin and yang to that to me, because having described what I've described to you, you can get lost in the complexity, and all of a sudden you miss the sophistication of simplicity. Because many of the bigger challenges that we're trying to tackle there are simple ways to actually affect change. And one of the podcast guests that I spoke to said that, you might reach 1 million people with this video, you might not, but actually if you go out today and you smile at 5 people and that provokes those 5 people to smile at another 5 people, it scales exponentially. By the end of the day, 1 million people may have smiled because you smiled. It's a very simplistic example, but the simplicity, the sophistication of simplicity of that single act can create a ripple effect much bigger than the initial act. And sometimes we get so caught up in the complexity that we miss the simplicity that's available to us within the complexity. And it's that constant dance between understanding how systems operate and interoperate, understand the complexity of all things, but also simultaneously seeking a level of sophistication in simplicity. And there's some great examples throughout history where that's been evidenced. So that's one thing. And then
is that being the change?
Yes, exactly. That brings that, because it's very easy, come back to the point around externalizing the problem. People are always very keen to, and there's the kind of as Cartman's drama triangle where we go into blame and victim, and we're all human. We fall into that, of course. But being the change, yes, it comes back to how our own decisions, how our own actions can have a ripple effect that's much beyond us, and that ripple can become a wave. And actually, that simple act of smiling to another human being, and I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen where I've smiled at someone and they've smiled back, and you can see it's probably the first time they've smiled that day. It's almost they're surprised.
Yeah. And to give your simplicity, complexity, paradox its fair due. Every time you go through a period of becoming really complex in your thinking, it usually amounts to something simple as the result. But, as a result of coming through that,
Yes.
Because before you did that work, you wouldn't understand the impact of your smile, probably.
Yes.
But now you do, and
yes.
It takes it back down to you.
Yes, but it comes down to, and when we talk about systems and society and organizations, again, we do so in a very dehumanized way, failing to remember that any organization or any society is simply a reflection of the individuals that comprise it. Systems are slightly different because there are mechanics involved, processes, but ultimately the systems that we operate within are built by and upheld by human beings. So one of our recent podcast interview guests, we were talking about the current health situation in the UK, and her motto was, the most radical health revolution we can create in Britain right now is by taking personal responsibility for our own personal health. If we become healthier as individuals, and we inspire, and by doing so we may inspire someone else to become healthy, again, it's the same ripple effect. Now, that doesn't solve the systemic issues that may be causing the problem, but it starts to...
But it does reveal a system, right?
Yes,
because if you're saying that the main thing is that somebody becomes response-able,
yes,
then the systemic issue is what are the conditions in which somebody becomes responsible? What is the education? What is the work-life balance? What is the, so, and then they are able,
yes.
I immediately think, universal basic income. And I mean, there's so much that comes up the minute you say that thing.
Yes.
Each time
Yes, but the I suppose that's where I pre-framed how the systems and the society culture is a reflection of the individuals, and if enough people change their behaviour. So to give that greater context, if we want a healthier planet and every individual makes a decision to live more lightly and live in accordance with nature, and that creates a ripple effect, all of a sudden, the system is changing by virtue. Maybe not as quick enough as we'd like, but to use the example of smiling and 5 people smiling a day, actually it can be lightning fast. Not quite lightning, let's be real, but you get the point. It can accelerate change, and it's so that there are things we can do on the individual level in that way, but then using some of the experiences that we've talked about today, for instance the community event, you can get people making decisions at a slightly larger scale in the course of, and we're not asking people to, we're not prescribing what those decisions need to be, but within the context of the environment that they're operating within, they can make decisions about how to alter the trajectory of their own lives, which will then create a ripple effect. So those opportunities create a greater opportunity for those changes to occur.
So we've got a few minutes left. How do you feel that this, first of all, could you describe it? And, what is this political tour that you're describing? And what do you think, how does that part of it operate?
Well, this I have less certainty on than what I've just said. The first point of the tour is we're seeing it as a multi-stage approach. The first is to get out into communities to speak about how politics is currently broken. And there seems to be, this is backed by data. I looked at the latest YouGov data on this. It's not always reliable, but I looked at it this morning and I looked at other data sources in the last week, which shows that general dissatisfaction in the political status quo in the UK is reasonably, depending on what data source you use, some are going as far as saying the highest of all time. I don't know, we've got enough history on that, but certainly the highest in the last 20 to 30 years. We're seeing some of the greatest level of political dissatisfaction, but also a loss of trust and a loss of confidence and loss of faith in politicians. So this is an emerging sentiment that is growing month on month. And what's really interesting, irrespective of one's past political loyalties, there is a shared sense that irrespective of what political decisions are made come the beginning of September, is that until the system that they operate within, even if they were the most desirable, influential leader you could ever imagine, I don't think there's a sense that that's happening, but that would be bringing my personal views into the matter, which we'll leave off the table for now. But there is a shared sentiment around that. But even despite our differences in views or potential differences in views on the particular individuals, they're still entering into the same system that's likely to continue to produce the same results. So I think there's an opportunity through the tour to galvanize that sense of frustration, which is evident. And I think you were, as part of our session actually, Indra, at the camp out where we said who in the room feels politically homeless, and I don't remember a single hand not going up. So there's which to me presents a unique opportunity, because historically it would be very easy to take a tour with a certain political leaning and gather support for people who already have the same political leanings as us. The aim is to go beyond that. This is everything we've talked about in this conversation. We're trying to bring to the tour. We're trying to bring people from all walks of life, all political leanings, with a shared set of dissatisfaction around the political status quo, to really use that opportunity to recognize that we have a problem, but B, to kind of inspire hope that it is possible through some of the things we've just discussed to be response able. I like that term. In our own lives, in our own communities, to start to affect some change. And then there's two dimensions to this, and I think we covered it at the beginning of the conversation. On one hand, it's some of the practical terms. We've got record hospital waiting lists right now, but we also have some really, really well qualified people inside of our local communities, healthcare practitioners who, when they get their minds together, may be able to take some of that pressure off. Similarly, the mental health crisis, within some of the official sources, the NHS, etc. Again, they may be overwhelmed, but again, there may be private practitioners. There may be different modes of, there may be different solutions that can actually help more people to deal with different difficulties. So the reality is that we're calling it a non-political political tour because we're dealing with political issues, but we're encouraging people to look at non-political solutions in the first instance, so that they can actually, they're still political solutions, but our definition of politics is predicated on an understanding that it's the people I described at the beginning of the conversation across green leather benches in Westminster. Politics, if we start to take politics into our daily lives, then we can affect change politically. But you don't have to become a politician to create political change. That's part of the message we want to take to the tour. And we want people to have a sense of empowerment that if they start to work together in their communities in the kind of numbers that we've talked about, they can, and the opportunity, the challenge is to try and help people find the kind of areas of change they're most passionate about. So if there's difficulties around the cost of living, who has an interest, skill set, and desire to go and support that particular area? So there's the specific and present challenges that I think can be eased, mitigated against, possibly even solved on a localized level, dealing with present challenges. The second and key dimension is the other side of that question, is then the systemic change. It's about creating a container for broader conversation around what would political transformation look like, and what types of conversations do we need to have about creating political transformation when it comes to political systems, and what would that look like on a local level. And it could start with an evaluation of how the political system is functioning in your particular area. It could look as an evaluation on a more aggregate scale at the national or even global level, to start to understand, to help develop an understanding, what are some of those core issues that we're witnessing, where is there commonalities, because again, if we are trying to bring people together from different political leanings, they're going to have different views. But we almost have to think differently about how we assess problems, because it's very easy to fall, and this was inspired by your session actually, we take old world problems into new world conversations, where we fall into the trap of legacy thinking, where we rather than thinking about the issue at hand and starting with a blank page and saying, okay, well, where do we see the real challenges are here? What's most important? What can we agree upon? Then we leave some of that baggage behind and start with an open book and start to say, okay, well, that's interesting. For instance, we share that corporate lobbying, for instance, is reached such a level that it's having excess influence over government. But at the same time, we're recognizing in our area, we've got less than 1% political party membership. So on the other hand, we don't have a process for the citizens to actually create political. So I'm just hypothetical scenarios where there may be points of agreement across political backgrounds, in which case it gives an edge, it gives a starting point to actually think about, okay, how do we develop solutions to these things? Now, we've already started to kind of mock processes around the concept of redesigning, using entrepreneurial thinking, redesigning political systems. And it's incredibly, it's a new scale of challenge, because even by just asking the initial opening question, what should be the role of the state or government, even in asking that question, there is such diversity of thought before you even get off the ground blocks. Maybe it's even best to ask, first of all, what is the role of the citizen? What is our responsibility in our community? And what's left after that? I don't know. But it's going to be a creative challenge to when we look at systems. But the goal of the tour is not for us to try and figure out the solution ourselves. There are people like yourself, there are other organizations that have already done a lot of the thinking that we're trying to begin with. We may bring some fresh thinking to some things, but we may also have huge gaps in other areas where we can actually, when we come together in these types of environments, we can have really constructive conversations. And we're starting to call it the ABCs, and this is perhaps the last, which is the academics. You've got people who have a scholarly approach to understanding problems, and they have a valuable input on this. And then you have to fit the acronym, we've kept it simple. We have those in the business of. So if we're talking business, we're talking politicians who are in the practice of politics. And then the C is the citizens. So by bringing together the ABCs, an academic doesn't have to be limited to institutional academia. It's just finding a simple way to say those who are in the business of thinking about and studying and researching particular issues, those that are practitioners who have lived experience, and those who are stakeholders as citizens, and how we can bring those groups together to start to bring different thinking around the more systemic issues. The first part of the tour is really about it's an educational element, but where we go next is then starting to look at how we create those working groups in the various areas, so that there is that momentum and that space repetition of action. I'm someone who likes to spend a lot of time planning and strategizing, but with this particular project, we wanted to get out at the same time as the political hustings. It's already started, so we're already behind the curve. But we want to get out there whilst the activity is happening and whilst there's press around the hustings, to try and see if we can get some wider attention on this type of activity. So that the meticulous planning that I'd like to go through, the depth of thinking, is that we haven't got the time. So we're gonna get the venues, we're gonna come up with our premise, We're gonna get out there and road test it and iterate. We're gonna take that entrepreneurial spirit, iterate as we learn.
Yeah.
And the front end, there's less pressure because it's more of an educational piece. It's more about getting to a sense of, okay, that we're here, we want to do something. The next stage then is, okay, well, what's next? And that we will have a little bit more time for that, thankfully. But in terms of getting off the ground and getting out into the cities and towns in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be a lot more entrepreneurial, grassroots. Learning by doing as opposed to learning by researching or thinking.
I love that. I love it. And political entrepreneur is a great title for this moment, actually. So Dan, thanks very much. I think you've got a really good comprehensive picture of what you're up to, and I'm sure it will attract a lot of people. And I'm particularly grateful to you for putting some sort of flesh on the bones of integral thinking in terms of politics, because I can really sense that there is a doingness to what you're, to what you're describing, as opposed to simply being a realm of thinking, which it can easily become. So thanks for that. And